This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Today's podcast episode looks at an area that I'm very passionate about: mental health and psychological well-being, and also the overlaps into performance. My guest today has just recently released a book called Skewed to the Right: Sport, Mental Health and Vulnerability. It's an excellent read. I definitely recommend you to take a look at it. In the book itself, clinical psychologist Dr. Amy Izycky, I hope I've got that right, Amy, interviews different athletes, former athletes, and individuals who've been involved in sport, and she goes on to discuss their individual stories, personalities, strengths, flaws, highs and lows. Check it out. And today, in this episode, we want to dig into some of those stories. We look at the intricacies of different sports, such as rowing and combat sports, and discuss the complexities involved in weight restrictions in these sports. We chat about high-performance sport in general and how it can promote obsessive behaviours and perfectionism. Then you've got macho behaviour and how they can be wrongly associated with mental toughness, which is also often encouraged in sport. Certainly the macho behaviour is. And then we piece all that together and we look at the potential impact on an individual's mental health. It's a fascinating episode. I really enjoyed recording, and I hope that you enjoy listening too. Could you tell the listeners a little bit about your experience in rowing, as well as discussing the complexities involved in sports that have got weight restrictions?
Yeah. So my background with sport is that I grew up in a family where me and my brother were competitive swimmers as kids. And that very much became a part of our family identity and our lifestyle, where at weekends we would be going to swimming galas. My father would be the timekeeper and the judge, and would be on the coach most Saturdays, traveling up and down the country to swim. And so it was in our background. And when I got to university, it was Freshers' Week, and I needed to make a decision about what I wanted to join up to and what I wanted to try. And I saw rowing, so I gave rowing a go, and I really enjoyed it. I then went on to compete at college level for my first year at university. And at the end of the summer term, I was in a boat where we won a college competition called the Hatfield Cup. And at that time, the university coach, who was also the GB development coach, was watching. And he approached my college coach and asked if I wanted to trial for the university. As a young 19 to 20-year-old, I think I was very flattered by this. I don't know if it was ever really my plan. But I went back to trial, and I was invited to row for the university. So I did that for a year, and it's fair to say that during that time, with my 1 year's experience thus far in rowing, compared to all of the other athletes, I certainly wasn't competitive in the open weight category. But they noticed that I was close to the lightweight range. So I was invited to become a lightweight rower. And I engaged with that process for a year. And I was competing at events like Tideway in London and Henley. But soon after Henley, I had to have surgery to remove my appendix. And after that, I decided not to go back to university rowing. But instead, in time, when I'd recovered physically and mentally, I think, I went back to college level rowing and then club level rowing after that. And my career in rowing probably ended about 5 years ago now. I haven't really been in a boat.
I can imagine the camaraderie's quite nice in rowing, the team element to it, as well as obviously the physical challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a team sport. You're in a boat and you're physically placed very close next to people in a boat. so and there's a lot of time spent training for rowing. So you really get very close to people and develop some really good relationships. And, I'm still incredibly close to people that I've rowed with more recently because it does become something that's such a feature in your life where you spend a lot of time with these people and you become very close.
Yeah, and certainly, well, rowers I've come across in the past, they spend quite a lot of time in the gym as well, obviously strength training.
Yeah, absolutely. So our regime was up early. This is university rowing, I should say, up early, good 2 or 3 hours on the water before 9 a.m. lectures, and then weights on an evening in the gym as a team. But you asked me about the impact of weight restricted sport, and the impact was, in addition to that training, you would then be asked to do, or you'd be encouraged to do, an additional weight management session as well. So not only were you doing the water session on the morning, but you would then be doing a long run on the afternoon and then weights on the evening. So you were looking at 3 training sessions throughout the day. And so, rowing does try and I think pride itself on being one of those sports where it says, we're a really tough sport and only the toughest can do this. We have the toughest regime in the university. And that there's certain things that are worn almost as badges of honour by rowers, really, where, you've got these horrific calluses on your hands, but it's almost as if, they're proud of them. And the fact that we're up before anybody else is up, that's something that's taken or seen with a lot of pride as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word tough there, which obviously links nicely to the podcast title with demystifying mental toughness. How damaging can that word tough or toughness be for people?
Yeah, so I struggle a little bit with the word toughness, and I don't know how popular as an opinion that's going to be. But so as athletes, of course, from personal experience and working with athletes as well, there is an element where, yes, we need to be tough. And certain personality traits such as focus, discipline, and aggression are celebrated. They're put on a pedestal. These are the things that we celebrate in our athletes. God, they're so disciplined. They're so focused. But there can be a negative impact of that from a clinical perspective. And of course, I'm coming at this as a clinical psychologist and a psychodynamic psychotherapist. So for me, there's 2 things to consider here in terms of what's the impact of this. And I think the first one to think about is control. And the second thing is the extreme versions of this. So, in order to meet our goals in sport, there has to be a level of aggression behind that. That's just a given. If we're not aggressive, we're not going to be in pursuit of those goals. So that can be helpful, but we have to be able to switch these traits on and off. So I'm sure you see athletes in the clinic quite often, potentially with anger or aggression difficulties, because aggression's great because it makes you strive for your goal. But ultimately, if you then can't control that on the pitch, it can put the individual and people around them at risk. So these are traits that we need to have control of. So the impact of them is that they can sometimes be quite damaging if we haven't got control of them. And of course, I'm talking about this as if it's an easy thing to do. We can just switch these things on and off within ourselves. And of course, that would be the case if we had conscious control of them. But as a psychodynamic psychotherapist, my interest lies in thinking about the unconscious world and what might be unconsciously driving us. And by the very nature of that, it suggests that we're not always aware of everything that's driving our behaviour. So that's sometimes when people would come and see me, because they might not have full insight or awareness into, well, why can't I control this? Something else is driving this. So that's the first impact, that we need to have control. But secondly, it's looking at the extreme versions of this. So what's the extreme version of toughness? Well, these personality traits within sport are helpful. There's no doubt about that. We need to be resilient. We need to be tough. The athlete that hits pain or something outside of their comfort zone and then says, "Oh, I'm done for today." They're kind of the athletes that potentially might not reach that high performance threshold because they give up when it gets uncomfortable. So we do need an element of pushing through the pain barrier or pushing through the comfort zone. But it's the extreme versions of this where it gets very unhelpful. So this is the argument of being skewed to the right. So the title of my book is Skewed to the Right. And I appreciate that my view on this is probably skewed because I'm a clinician. So I only see people that are struggling with this because they're coming into the clinic. But what I do see is that for people that don't fall within that average range for focus, discipline, masochism, and obsessionality, if they sit to the right of that, so they have higher levels of masochism or higher levels of obsessionality, which we do need for sport, by the very nature of having higher levels, they're then getting closer to that extreme end where we're looking at clinical significance. So to give you an example, if we think about the double-edged sword of masochism, so pushing through pain, we've just acknowledged that you need to be able to do that in order to push through your comfort zone and then achieve these incredible things. But then what happens if you then start to enjoy pain? And then what happens if pain becomes a familiar way in which you relate to yourself and the world? Potentially, we're then slipping into something like self-harming behaviour or bulimia. And that's very different to pushing through your comfort zone. And similarly with obsessionality, it's good to be obsessive about a training regime. We need to focus on our eating, our training, our sleep. But if we then become obsessive about things outside of sport, and that becomes pervasive within our everyday lives, and we can't leave a restaurant for an hour because we're obsessively aligning our cutlery and our glasses, then we're looking at something like OCD or obsessionality disorders. So it's really about the extreme versions of these that can be most concerning.
And in some ways that differentiates like my work from your work, where as a sports psychologist, I see that this tough mentality of pushing through, getting your head down and just getting on with things. And from that, I can see, aggressive behaviour and the blame game, people like criticising other people. What I can get involved in there is those responses, those actions, and how they can potentially change them. But also with that type of behaviour, you tend to find people self-loathe and that they're quite very critical of themselves. So where I can support someone to try and change their dialogue inside there, obviously for you, your role is at a more deeper level there when you talk about potentially with OCD and self-harm and eating disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've had a bit of a conversation about this already in terms of the importance of identifying and educating about the difference in our work and our roles, and how important it is that people know the difference, in that, for sports psychology, and you're better to educate on this than me, David, this is what you do on a daily basis, but, it's about optimizing performance, and then also identifying if there are any mental health concerns, but if there are, then signposting onto someone like me, because then we get into the clinical psychology stuff, where it's tipped over into something a bit more unmanageable or distressing. And I think that's the most important thing to identify here, in that there are many people in the sporting world that have these character traits, but they're not distressing to them. They work for them. And in that sense, you or I just wouldn't get involved with them, actually, because they're functional, they work for them. And the only time that I would get involved is if someone says to me, look, this is what's going on, and it's starting to get quite distressing. It's starting to bubble over into something else in terms of mental health, and my wider life. And if they're then telling me that it no longer works for them, that's when we start to intervene.
This is a short advertisement introducing the sponsor for the show, Chimera Sport, who produce a range of sportswear and equipment to help enhance performance and recovery, reducing injury occurrences. And as someone who has had long-standing back issues, I've personally tested some of the garments and I've been more than happy with them. You'll also find that the infrared sportswear has been clinically tested too, so it's great for fitness enthusiasts who want to push harder, go further, and recover quicker. More details can be found on the product section of our website and in the show notes. So as you quite rightly said there, my role is more about optimizing performance. So I think, if I was to look back at all my clients, probably 80% of those would be performance related, and then maybe 20% of the work might touch on mental health, but it's more about like proactive measures in order so that they feel better in themselves and they're able to train well and perform well. And I suppose one of the things I notice is, again, with this whole toughness culture about pushing through, is athletes can struggle to actually just sit back and actually rest and recover well, which links us quite nicely to macho behaviour. And it's often encouraged in sport. Do you want to share with the listeners some of the potential impacts that macho behaviour, where it can harm your mental health?
Yeah. So I think, again, from my perspective in the clinic, if someone starts to talk to me about macho behaviour or toughness, I have to consider whether or not something else is at play here, where is something being defended against. So the whole premise of the psychoanalysis is to think about what's in our unconscious worlds and what is it that we are defending against. Now, we all have defense mechanisms. They're all there for a reason, and it's not my job to come in and break those down unless, again, somebody tells me that they're distressed by something. So from experience and talking to people in the book, and clinically working with athletes, I think sometimes when macho behaviour comes unhelpful is when it has become a defensive reaction to wanting to ignore or not go near vulnerability within ourselves. And for me, my argument is that in order to be incredibly successful or resilient, I think I prefer the term resilient, having an awareness and insight into our vulnerabilities is absolutely the thing that can become one of our biggest assets when we're trying to perform or when we're just trying to get on with our daily lives, really.
Yeah, and one of the elements of mental toughness, funny enough, is learning orientation, which really is all about learning from your mistakes and actually delving that little bit deeper into understanding those vulnerabilities, those fears, and certainly, well, Peter Clough, who's done an awful lot of research in this area, would say being comfortable in your own skin is the key, really, around mental toughness. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this right now, but you might want to help me out.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I think it's a lovely way of looking at it. Absolutely. You know, in terms of what I strive for as a clinical psychologist and as a psychodynamic psychotherapist, people may be disappointed with this, but I'm not striving for extreme happiness as an outcome of therapy. I'm striving for something very similar to that we're just okay, you know, that there is a balanced appraisal of life and ourselves, and that there are good parts, that there are bad parts, and that we're just okay with that. And that, for me, is an excellent outcome. So I like that as a description.
No, I think now my brain's kicked back into gear, so I know where I'm going with that. Because often people's egos can get in the way. Well, I was going to say certainly in sport, but even in life, in the business world in general. So if you're comfortable in your own skin, then you're going to give yourself a much better chance of being happier on a day-to-day level, and then being able to put 100% into your training and your competing. So from our nice, interesting discussion here, firstly, would you be able to share with the listeners who's been the biggest influence on your career to date?
Oh, goodness. You did send this one to me beforehand, didn't you? I think this is the one, the one I've probably neglected to think about the most. I don't know whether there's one individual, to be honest. I think, you know, going through my career, it's been quite organic, really. I've kind of gone down various different paths at different stages. And at all of those stages, I've had various mentors. And I think each of them has been incredibly helpful at advising me at each stage. I think more recently, doing my psychodynamic training, having analysis myself as part of that for a good number of years was incredibly influential. And I don't think I would be doing what I'm doing today, or would have been able to have delivered the book, if it wasn't for having my own analysis. It was absolutely what we've just been talking about in terms of increasing insight and awareness into myself, my own vulnerabilities, and being comfortable with that, you know, in that we all have parts of ourselves that we don't really like. But, you know, you've referenced ego. There's an element of having to identify those parts of ourselves, knowing that they live within us, knowing that they can be triggered at certain times, and accepting that. And if you can accept that, that's when the defense mechanisms don't necessarily have to be in place. And so we don't have to potentially overcompensate with macho or toughness or whatever word we're going to use. We can just be okay with ourselves and accept who we are. And I think so for that reason, I think I'd probably have to say that it's been my own analyst that has probably been the most influential in my career and my personal life.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I know from my experience of my training, a part of that involves like quite detailed supervision. And then again, in my past, I've had personal counselling as well. I think just when you've got that level of support at hand, which some other professions don't, it can provide, well, it helps you so much with, like you say, your self-awareness, so that then you can just feel that little bit happier in yourself and more fulfilled.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's part of our regulation. You know, we have to have supervision, but good supervision shouldn't feel as if it's just enforced compliance. We're just doing it to tick a box. Good supervision feels valuable and supportive, and helps us to think about ourselves, our work, and makes us better clinicians so that we can deliver the best service to the individuals that we work with and that trust us to do such an important job for them.
Yeah, and that's the most important thing, isn't it? Ultimately, is to provide exactly the best service that you possibly can for your clients, and the best advice as well. So, from our discussion, what would you say are the 3 key takeaways for the listeners?
Okay, so I think given my experience with sports people and mental health, I think the 3 take-homes would have to be the importance of balance. You know, it's when I see these extremes that I tend to see the mental health presentations. So, you know, as you referenced earlier, the importance of rest, the importance of recovery days, that's both physically and mentally. So the importance of balance. But also in our discussion, we've spoke about the importance of connecting with vulnerability. I think this is just one of the greatest assets that we can all have. You know, what are our trigger points? We do this in physical health. You know, we have physios looking at our athletes to say, what are their physical vulnerabilities? Where is the imbalance in strength? Where is the physical injury concern or point of vulnerability? And I think that we're missing something here with psychology and mental health, that we should be doing the same with our athletes with regard to their psychology. So what are their points of vulnerability? You know, you referenced earlier, do they have an overly critical or punitive narrative towards themselves? And if that is the case, then we need to recognise that. We need to increase insight into that. And we need to support the athlete to start to question that at times. So was it helpful for me to be critical at that point? Was I overly critical? Am I taking this too far now? Do I need to be compassionate towards myself at this point? Because actually that's quite unhelpful. So I think the importance of connecting with vulnerability and recognising those trigger points. And then finally, the last one, you're making me think. The last one, I think the importance of identifying when some of these helpful character traits bubble over into something more distressing or concerning, and the importance of keeping an eye on that, because we know that we need these character traits. We need to be obsessive. We need to be a bit masochistic. We need to be a bit aggressive in high performance sport. But it's keeping an eye on that and making sure that they don't bubble over into something that starts to cause distress or impact upon our personal lives, relationships, jobs for some high performance athletes. And if that is the case, then recognising when you might need to see a professional about that. So either myself for mental health concerns or yourself to identify strategies to be proactive about managing that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love those 3 bits of advice there that you've passed on to people. And really, in a nutshell, that all falls around self-awareness, doesn't it? And knowing yourself better, so that you can put better strategies in place and you can make better decisions day in, day out. And I think, okay, that does help from a mental health angle. But even from a performance side, you see an awful lot of athletes who are striving day in, day out, yet they don't actually get any better. They have those performance plateaus. Yet if they had that balance where they maybe took a day off from time to time, they, like you say, connected with the vulnerability, their fears, they might be able to overcome things and kick on. And then again, with your last point there, that's fantastic. So whereabouts can the listeners find you, Amy, on social media or through your work?
Yeah, so I currently work for myself. So I have my own website, which is dramyizycky.com. You might have to spell my name at some point, David, for people to find me. It's not the easiest to spell. And again, on LinkedIn, I'm on there as Dr. Amy Izycky, and Instagram. as well. So I've got a few platforms at the moment.
Great. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'll put all of those notes, all of those links there in the show notes for the listeners so they can find you easily. And please, you mentioned your surname, because I was going to ask you afterwards exactly how I pronounced it. You've done that for me.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
So appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks.
It was great to listen to Amy discuss the complexities surrounding high-performance sport and mental health. And governing bodies have certainly come a long way in the field, but there's an awful lot more that can be done. And as a sports psychologist, I'm aware of the links between mental health, psychological well-being, and performance. Yet I operate at a lower level, where I support athletes, coaches, and organisations to consider the basic fundamentals that are required for them to live a happy life and perform well at the same time. I'll get drawn into conversations regarding traps that they fall into, where their thinking is unhelpful, and we may go on to look at trying to restructure their thoughts so that they're better placed to help themselves. Other ways I'll help athletes is by counselling them, simply giving them space, a trusting space to offload and share their difficulties. We often then go on to set some simple goals along the way. I'll give you an example. Currently, I'm working with 2 footballers and they've got long-term serious injuries. One of the goals may well be to have a conversation with an S&C coach to change up their gym program. It sounds pretty simple, but that particular person isn't necessarily very assertive, doesn't like that type of conversation. Another goal is to start journaling, to write down 3 things that you're grateful for each and every morning. That's something I'm a fan of if you've listened to the podcast before. All in all, though, for me, to perform at your best, positive mental health is so important. As someone who I suppose I could say I'm middle-aged, scary thought that is, I feel quite rounded. I've personally experienced many things that have impacted on my own mental health. But I didn't realise that at the time. Things like redundancies, the death of close loved ones, relationship breakups, in elite amateur sport for me, not being selected for teams, being bullied and so on. So I feel pretty well qualified personally as well as professionally through different qualifications, and having a wife who's a counselling psychologist, that also helps. Where the line is drawn is when we start touching on eating disorders, depression, anxiety, addictions, or other mental health conditions. And this is where I would go on to draw on the support of skilled practitioners like Amy or other clinical or counselling psychologists. And knowing your role as a sports psychologist is massively essential in being able to draw upon these different practitioners. I'm aware as an athlete or a coach, it can be really difficult to navigate our field. The role of a sports psychologist can be muddied by different people who advertise their services, mind coaches, clinical psychologists who dabble in sport, counselling psychologists who also work in sport. My advice is to do your homework, look at the expertise of the different practitioner, look at the qualifications, ask about the qualifications, and have a good discussion with them. That way you'll know if you're in safe hands or not. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I certainly did. Please feel free to share the love and rate and review positively using Apple Podcasts. I'd be really grateful if you could do so. Enjoy the week ahead. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.